Last week we looked at chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. We talked about how we can endure and that call to endure. And we looked at verses 2 and 3 particularly as the example of Jesus, as the way of looking at how he approached it and understood what he had to endure, that we might not grow weary, that we might not faint back, but that we in fact would continue to press forward and we would endure as well. And so last week I addressed this idea that at least so far in our reading of Hebrews, there was two, and then this week is the third one, examples and challenges which they, like us, often face that cause us to want to shrink back, that we've got to endure. The first one was the idea of persecution, that they were facing persecution, and mentioned the fact that Paul tells us that whoever wants to live a godly life will, in fact, face persecution, just like them. Secondly, that there is the trials and testing of their faith that God brings about into their lives, and we've got to endure that. We've got to press on because that's going to do a perfecting work in our lives. And the third one, which I kind of just began to highlight last week, and that's going to be the focus of this week, is this idea of discipline, that God disciplines those ones he loves. And that if we're going to be disciplined, we got to endure that because God's doing a work in our lives. And so when you think about all of those areas and you think about what it's like to go through challenges in life, realize that you can't really move beyond it until you understand and comprehend that God is up to something, that he's at work behind the scenes, that he has got intentions of what he wants to do in our lives, that he is crafting this, that the race that is marked out before us, that is set out before us, involves all of these difficult challenges because God has got something in mind. And so when I was processing that this week, and I immediately thought of a story that maybe some of you might be familiar with. There's this guy named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. That ring any bells? Okay, no bells. All right, that's okay. I'll tell you about this guy. Okay, so he was one of the probably most prolific and most outstanding and well-known dissident of the Soviet Union. He was born a Russian Orthodox in the Soviet Union, and he grew up but denounced his faith. He turned away from God, became a member of the Communist Party. While he was serving in the army in World War II, in the Soviet army, he became quite disillusioned with what was going on. He began to recognize the atrocities and just the horrible nature of the way the Soviet government and the Communist Party were abusing people and all the atrocities that were taking place. And he began to be an outspoken opponent of these things and he would try to shine the light on what was taking place. Well, it doesn't take long within a communist government if you are a dissident to get people's attention. Reality is that the Soviet Union killed 20 million of their own people over the course of 30 or 40 years. But they developed this thing called, maybe you've heard of this term, the Gulag. The Gulag is actually a Russian acronym for the institution that oversaw these forced labor camps. And so Solzhenitsyn was given a sentence for 10 years to serve in these forced labor camps. Years later, he came back to Christ, and he actually was released, and he was then exiled and came to live in the United States. And in those years, in that late 60s, somewhere along the line, he related a story that Billy Graham heard and then shared it in some of his crusades. And so what happens is Solzhenitsyn says that at some point in time, while he was in the Gulag, he became so depressed with what was going on, so demoralized, so lacking hope that he considered taking his life. And so there was a progression of his deterioration of health and his attitude, and that other prisoners recognized. Now, that was pretty common those days to see that happen because many died through malnutrition and the abuse and the cold weather, sometimes in Siberia and places like that. But see, they were not allowed to talk with one another. So he could never express himself, nor could someone encourage him, come alongside. They weren't allowed to speak. But on one of those days, when he was depressed and sitting in his cell, considering taking his life, a fellow prisoner looked at him, recognizing how difficult things were for him. And he did just one very simple act. He walked over and took a stick, and on the floor of the dirt cell, he just simply made this sign of a cross. That's all he did. And then got up and walked away. Solzhenitsyn he looks at this, and of course, that's not something that would be unfamiliar to him. He's seen many, many crosses. But that day, the Spirit of God renewed his heart, spoke to him, and this is what he said. Solzhenitsyn said, "At that moment, the whole purpose of my existence dawned upon me. Because I realized that Jesus Christ shed his blood for me on that cross. That gave me the courage to live through my imprisonment." And he recognized that God had placed him there to be a voice for those who could not speak. Remarkably, he was allowed to publish a book. It's a short story called A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Maybe? No? Okay. All right, in the late 60s, but that was spread around the globe, and people began to see the atrocities that were taking place in the Soviet Union. He later wrote this massive volume called the Gulag Archipelago, which is a history of this gulag over 40 or 50 years, speaking on behalf, and God used him in remarkable ways. But for him, the very first step was this. The step that he had to go through in order to be used by God. He had to get it. He had to understand that God had a purpose of doing something, why he was there, why he was suffering and going through that gulag experience. So then God could use him in the future. See, there's a promise that we have to grab a hold of. It's found in this passage, and we're going to see it, that until God sometimes can use us, we got to get it. We got to get it. We got to understand that God has got something going on in our lives that sometimes we don't fully understand, but it's for his purpose. We can't just stay in our depressed state. We can't just stay in our wallowing in our suffering. But God wants us to discover something, to embrace that this is a plan of God in order that we can take that next step, which I'll call, we got to get up and get healed. And then thirdly, so we get going. We get going about doing God's work. So here we go. With that in mind, chapter 12, verse 4. Again, the backdrop is already what Jesus has done for us in verses 2 and 3. So this is what he said, and this is how I want to describe it. Endurance gets it. And so where the author is going right here is that he wants them to get this, that God is making you holy because we're his kids, that because we belong to him. So chapter 12, verse 4 starts off this way. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Now that's probably right now triggering your mind, shedding of blood. That's a phrase that's used about Jesus, right? Well, that's exactly where it comes from. Verse 2 and 3 goes back to this idea, reminding them who did shed his blood. It was Jesus. Verse 2, basically, it says there, who endured the cross. Verse 3, endured from sinners. And so our author is saying, okay, let's look back at Jesus. The endurance that he had to go through, the trial that he had to go through, the suffering that he had to go through, it led him to the shedding of blood and giving his life. You Hebrews, what you're going through is bad, but it's not to the point yet of shedding your blood. It's almost like he's saying that, okay, it's bad, I get that, but you're still alive. And you know what? If you're still alive, there's more to come. Isn't that a nice warm fuzzy? That's my favorite word today, probably, the phrase. Isn't that a nice warm fuzzy? He says, there's more to come. And so if there's more to come, there's more work that God wants to do in your life, then all right, let's get ready. And this is what's really going to help you get this. And so what he's going to do is going to remind us that, see, God is about the work of allowing discipline in your life to make you holy, which is a demonstration, and it is the evidence that we belong to him, that we're his. So verse 5 starts off this way. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? And then he quotes Proverbs chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. And he says, my son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. I'm going to do what I did last week. Acknowledge to me, look up some way, raise your hand, nod your head, or something like that. Do you believe you're loved by God? Okay, here's the promise. Those of you loved by God, the Lord disciplines the one he loves. Is there any surprise here? Discipline, if it's not already there, it's coming. It's coming. And he chastises every son whom he receives. Verse 7, he says, it is for discipline that you have to endure. You see, God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? Of course. If you are left without discipline in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. He's reminding you what you're going through, this discipline you're going through, is evidence that you belong to him, that you're his. That should encourage you. Oh, yay, Dad has disciplined me again. Oh, joy, right? That's what he is saying, though. Now, for you and me, I don't know if the question comes in, but I kind of think, okay, well then, persecution, trials and testing, discipline, how do I understand and comprehend what I'm going through? Is that discipline? It's not so much like, a father with a teenage boy who comes home late. Actually, I found somebody who, this illustration was perfect last service. They were driving and they got caught doing something, and so mom and dad took away the car keys. See, that's really simple to kind of grab a hold of. I do this, and I get disciplined for this, and I understand that. Well, on the spiritual side of it, it's hard to grasp, isn't it? Is this discipline? So what did I do? Am I missing something? Well, I think the passage itself helps us to understand what discipline is. Because it's this relationship between a father and a child. And so this word child or sons or children that you see in this, within that word is the word, within the word discipline is the word child. It's child instruction. What God is doing in our lives is child instruction. You and me, we're children, okay? And we need instruction. But notice the nuance. If we jump down to verse 11, for the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. This is not like, child instruction with, hey, let me show you something, what our son or daughter, and isn't this nice? No, this is the dark side of that, the painful side of that. It's the kind of instruction I'm not looking forward to, and children don't looking for. It's painful. And so in reality, when you think about what discipline that God does, it is, think about this, it's to help us to mature. That's what a father and a mother do. They're trying to help their kids mature. And so God is going to bring into your life anything that it takes to help you mature spiritually. In essence, what we know to be true is that he wants us to mature to become just like his son Jesus, that we would look like him, that our character, our priorities, our lives would look like Jesus. The New Testament says it this way, that we would walk as Jesus walked. Essentially live like Jesus, reflect our lives matching Jesus. And so, he moves on to verse 9. Check this out. Besides this, we had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. So he's going to set up this idea of what an earthly father looks like and what they do. And we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? This idea of maturing in the spiritual lives. For these earthly fathers, they discipline us for a short time as it seemed best to them. Now, if you're a son or a daughter right now, you kind of go, Yep, that's pretty much dad. What seems best to him. He's no idea how to do this right? But the reality is that we do our best most of the time, and we understand that. But God, this is the middle of verse 10, he disciplines us for our good. He knows what it's going to take to bring goodness in us. That we may share, and here it is, that we may share his holiness. Verse 11, for the moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. See, God is about doing the work of making us holy. This is one of my pet peeves. There's a lie out there, okay? There's a lie out there. The world believes that God wants us to be happy. And that lie sometimes creeps into here. And we go, God wants me to be happy. And so we do the things that we believe are, it's, fudge it here and there or whatever because God wants me to be happy. You see, it's pretty clear. God wants us to be holy. And oftentimes there's a lot of unhappiness to holiness. See, this is what the remarkable thing is. On the way to holiness, one of the byproducts of that is what I'll call joy. And for the sake of this morning, I want to distinguish between joy and happiness. See, joy is non-circumstantial. It's despite what I'm going through. Happiness is a lot of times what's happening, circumstantial. When things are good, I'm happy. When things are bad, I'm not happy. And you see, holiness pursues Christ's likeness. And in the midst of that, there's a hope and a trust and a faith and a maturity that brings about a joy in the Lord. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. That's what God is after in our lives. But you see, that's really hard to take sometimes. So let's step back for a moment and see the big picture. Or let me ask you this. Look at your life through the lens of the biblical view of God and who he is and what he's up to. See, our God works all things according to the counsel of his will. Going back to 12:2, the founder and perfecter of our faith. He is the author, the founder. He begins our faith, and he also is the one who is perfecting our faith. And so he's got to bring about things in our lives to bring about that perfection. But here's the challenge for us. When you look at the scope of your life and you look at the ups and downs of the things that you have to suffer through and the things that are not going the way that you would like them to go, do you ask yourself, where did this come from? So we have this tendency to give praise to God for all the good things in our lives and to complain about the bad things. We even pray, God, basically remove every difficulty from my life. Make my life easier, please. When in fact, God goes, well, actually, if you're praying for my will, get ready for some discipline. Get ready for what I'm going to do in your life. And so here's the challenge. Here's what I want us to think and what we've really kind of got to get. See, there's nothing that does not pass by and through the decreed, direct, or permissive will of God. Essentially what I'm saying is this, that God acts directly many times, and we kind of look at that and we kind of go, yes, I can grab that. But then God allows and permits things in our life. We kind of go, where did that come from? I'm not saying God is the author of evil, but I'm saying is that God sometimes permits these things in our life to accomplish a greater purpose. Think about Job chapter 1. Satan approaches God, says, let me at Job. Because he knows he's got to have permission from God, who is sovereign over all things, who knows all things, who's omniscient, he's omnipotent, he has a power over things, but he's a holy God, a loving God. And so he has to get permission from God. And God says, okay. And for you and me, we kind of go, wait. I don't want to go through this stuff. But it's already past God's desk. He's already given his approval. Isn't that remarkable? Like I said, God's not the author of evil, but in his wisdom, he allows it. Take a look back. Let's go back to chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. Once again, look at the example in the life of Jesus. Verse 2, look into Jesus, and again says, who for the joy that was set on him endured the cross. Whose idea was the cross? It was God the Father's idea. We look back at Genesis chapter 3, we'll see there was a plan from the very beginning. As soon as mankind fell, God says, now I'm going to start telling you about my plan that I put in place before the foundation of the earth. A plan that would send my son, God the Son, to the cross. That's what he intended. But then look at verse 3, and this is kind of where I want us to camp out for just a moment. Because it says, consider him who endured from sinners. In other words, he suffered at the hands of sinners. Such hostility against himself. That was part of God's plan too, to suffer from the sin of others. If you look back at Acts chapter 2, the very first message, the very first after Pentecost message of the gospel of Jesus, Peter says this in chapter 2, verse 23. He says, this Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. Jesus was delivered up at the hands of sinners, betrayed, lied about, abused, beaten, mocked, scourged. That was a part of God's plan. And so for you and me, one thing we've got to grab a hold of is that these things that are going on in our lives, even the difficulties, even the challenges, even the things that are, why? It's because God's got a purpose in our life. He's allowing it so he may make you holy. Think about that for a moment. It's like saying, thank you. I'm going to embrace that. I hope I fly through it as fast as possible. But that's what you have for me right now. But you notice when you begin to trust in a God who is like that and who's doing this and has our best interests in mind, and we can believe and trust and hope in him, that allows us to endure that, knowing there's something better coming. And so that's why in verse 12, the author says, therefore. In other words, I want you to grab this concept. I want you to grab a hold that God is doing a work in your life and he is disciplining you to shape you and molding you, to make you more like Jesus. So then, therefore, listen to this. Lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees and make straight paths for your feet so that what is lame may not be put out of joint but rather be healed.